In a temperature-controlled vault at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library sits a book that has defeated every attempt to read it for over 600 years. Not because it's damaged, not because pages are missing, but because it's written in a language, or perhaps a code, that no one on Earth can understand. The Voynich Manuscript contains 240 pages filled with text, approximately 35,000 words written in an elegant, flowing script that looks almost familiar, as if it should make sense, as if you're on the verge of understanding it. But you never do. The manuscript is also filled with illustrations, hundreds of them, botanical drawings of plants that don't exist, astronomical charts mapping stars that can't be found, naked women bathing in interconnected pools of green liquid, diagrams that might be pharmaceutical recipes or might be something else entirely. Every element of this book suggests it was created with great care, deliberate purpose, and profound knowledge. The vellum it's written on dates to the early 15th century. The ink is period appropriate. The binding techniques are consistent with medieval manuscripts. This is not a modern forgery. This is a genuine artifact from the past. And yet, despite efforts by the world's greatest cryptographers, linguists, historians, and computer scientists, despite the application of artificial intelligence and statistical analysis, despite being studied intensively for over a century, we still cannot read a single word. Here's what makes the Voynich Manuscript different from every other unsolved cipher in history. This isn't just an encrypted message. This is an entire book, a reference work, perhaps an encyclopedia, containing what appears to be systematic knowledge about botany, astronomy, biology, and medicine. Someone knew something. They wrote it down carefully, organized it methodically, illustrated it beautifully, and then it vanished into incomprehensibility. Tonight, we're going to examine this manuscript page by page, section by section. We'll follow the attempts to decode it, from Renaissance scholars to World War II codebreakers to modern AI researchers.
We'll explore every major theory about what it might be, who might have created it, and why. And we'll discover that sometimes the most profound mysteries aren't about what was lost. They're about what was deliberately hidden. Welcome to the Relic Compendium. This is the story of the Voynich Manuscript. Part 1. Discovery and the Mystery of Provenance. Our story begins not in the 15th century, but in 1912. Wilfrid Voynich is a Polish revolutionary turned antiquarian book dealer, operating out of London. He has made a career of hunting down rare manuscripts, particularly those with unusual or controversial histories. He is in Italy, visiting the Jesuit college at the Villa Mondragone, when he discovers something extraordinary. In a chest, among various other manuscripts that the Jesuits are quietly selling to raise funds for their college, Voynich finds a book unlike any he has ever seen. It is bound in worn vellum, approximately 9 inches tall by 6 inches wide. The pages are made of animal skin, vellum, prepared in the medieval manner. And every page is covered in a script he cannot identify, accompanied by bizarre illustrations. Voynich is an educated man. He knows Latin, Greek, and several modern European languages. He has handled thousands of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. But this text is completely unknown to him. He purchases the manuscript along with several others. But this particular book captivates him. He brings it back to London and begins showing it to experts, hoping someone can identify the language or script. No one can. Voynich spends years trying to decipher it, and eventually trying to find others who might succeed where he has failed. He has photostats made, high-quality photographic copies, and distributes them to cryptographers, linguists, and historians around the world. The manuscript becomes his obsession. It will bear his name forever, though he did not create it, did not write it, and never understood it.
When Wilfrid Voynich dies in 1930, the manuscript passes to his widow, Ethel Voynich, herself a notable figure, a novelist best known for writing The Gadfly. After her death, the manuscript eventually makes its way through dealers and collectors, until it is donated to Yale University in 1969, where it remains today, catalogued as MS 408. But this provenance, this chain of ownership, only takes us back to 1912. Where was the manuscript before that? Fortunately, the manuscript itself contains clues. Tucked inside, when Voynich found it, was a letter. The letter is dated 1666, written in Latin by Johannes Marcus Marci, a rector of the University of Prague. It is addressed to the famous Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome. In this letter, Marci explains that he is sending Kircher a mysterious book that once belonged to his friend, a physician named Georg Baresch. Baresch had spent years trying to decipher the manuscript and had corresponded with Kircher about it, hoping the great scholar could help. Baresch had failed. He died without understanding the book. Now Marci is sending it to Kircher, believing that if anyone can decode it, surely it would be Athanasius Kircher, a polymath who claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics and written extensively on cryptography and universal languages. The letter also contains an intriguing piece of information. Marci mentions that the manuscript was once rumored to have been purchased by Emperor Rudolf II of Prague for 600 ducats, an enormous sum, equivalent to several years' salary for a skilled craftsman. Rudolf II, Marci writes, believed the manuscript was the work of the English philosopher and scientist Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar and philosopher from the 13th century, known for his emphasis on empirical observation and experimental science. A man centuries ahead of his time, who wrote about flying machines, submarines, and telescopes long before such things existed. Could this manuscript really be the work of Roger Bacon?
This connection to Rudolf II is significant for another reason. Rudolf II was Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612, and he reigned from Prague, which he transformed into a center of art, science, and occult knowledge. His court was filled with alchemists, astronomers, and mystics. If the manuscript was indeed in Rudolf's collection, it would have been examined by some of the greatest minds of the late Renaissance. But there's a problem with this story. There is no independent confirmation that Rudolf II ever owned the manuscript. The only evidence is Marci's letter, which is itself repeating a rumor. And the attribution to Roger Bacon? Even more speculative. Modern scholars are skeptical of the Roger Bacon connection. The manuscript style, the details of its illustrations, and most importantly, its carbon-dated age, all suggest it was created in the early 15th century, about 150 years after Roger Bacon died. Still, the Rudolf II connection gives us a possible window into the manuscript's earlier history. If it was in Prague in the late 16th century, how did it get there? And where did it come from originally? Here we enter the realm of speculation, built on fragments of evidence and suggestive clues. One theory traces the manuscript back to northern Italy, possibly the region around Venice or Milan. This theory is based on certain stylistic elements in the illustrations, particularly the architectural features visible in some of the diagrams. Crenellations on walls that resemble northern Italian castles. Bathing scenes that might reflect Italian Renaissance spa culture. There is also a tantalizing signature, or what might be a signature, on the first page of the manuscript. In the top right corner, barely visible, are the words Jakobji Detepenek,
This has been interpreted by some researchers as the name of Jacobus Horsicki de Tepenec, a minor noble who served as Rudolf II's personal physician and was later ennobled. If this is indeed Tepenec's signature, it suggests he owned the manuscript at some point, likely before it passed to Georg Baresch. But it doesn't tell us where Tepenec obtained it, or whether he ever understood what it contained. Another intriguing theory, proposed by some researchers, is that the manuscript might have been created in a monastery or convent, possibly by nuns with limited formal education in Latin, but considerable knowledge of herbalism and medicine. This would explain certain linguistic oddities in the script and the focus on botanical and pharmaceutical content. But again, these are theories built on circumstantial evidence. The truth is, before the manuscript appears in the collection of Georg Baresch in Prague in the early 17th century, its history is largely unknown. What we do know, with scientific certainty, is this. The vellum, the animal skin on which the manuscript is written, has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, specifically between 1404 and 1438. This was determined through radiocarbon testing conducted by the University of Arizona in 2009, using samples from 4 different pages. This tells us that the physical object was created in the early 1400s. It does not tell us when the text was written. The ink could theoretically have been added later. But most experts believe the manuscript was composed shortly after the vellum was prepared. There would be little reason to save blank vellum for decades before writing on it. So we have a book, created in the early 15th century, somewhere in Europe, most likely Italy or the Germanic regions, by an unknown author, for an unknown purpose, in an unknown language. And that is where the mystery truly begins. Before we dive into the content of the manuscript, let's take a moment to appreciate the object itself. The Voynich Manuscript, as it exists today, consists of 240 pages, though it's clear from the quire structure that some pages are missing. Quires are the folded sheets of vellum that, when stacked and bound, form the book. Analysis of the quire structure suggests that the original manuscript.
Each page measures approximately 23.5 centimeters tall by 16.2 centimeters wide, roughly 9 inches by 6 inches. This is a comfortable size for a personal reference book, easy to hold and read. The vellum itself is of high quality. Vellum is made from calfskin, sheepskin, or goatskin that has been stretched, scraped, and treated to create a smooth writing surface. It was expensive in the medieval period, which tells us that whoever commissioned or created this manuscript had significant resources. This was not a casual project. The text is written in a consistent hand throughout, suggesting a single author or a scribe copying from a single source. The writing is fluid and confident. There are very few corrections or crossed-out words, far fewer than you typically find in medieval manuscripts where scribes made frequent errors and had to make corrections. This suggests either that the author was transcribing from a carefully prepared draft, or that the text was being generated through some systematic process that required little correction. The ink is iron gall ink, the standard writing medium of medieval Europe. Iron gall ink is made from tannic acids derived from oak galls mixed with iron sulfate. It produces a dark, durable ink that was used for centuries. Chemical analysis confirms that the ink in the Voynich manuscript is consistent with 15th century European ink-making practices. The manuscript is divided into 6 distinct sections, each with different types of illustrations and, researchers believe, different subject matter. We'll explore each section in detail later, but for now, just know that the book appears to be organized like a reference work or encyclopedia, with each section devoted to a particular topic. The binding is relatively simple. Vellum pages sewn together and wrapped in a limp vellum cover. This style of binding was common for personal or working manuscripts, as opposed to the elaborate leather bindings with metal clasps used for prestigious presentation volumes. Everything about the manuscript's physical construction suggests authenticity. This is not a modern forgery. This is a genuine medieval document, created with period-appropriate materials and techniques, which makes its incomprehensibility all the more baffling.
Who created this manuscript? Over the years, numerous candidates have been proposed. We've already mentioned Roger Bacon, the 13th century friar, though the carbon dating rules him out. Still, the idea that the manuscript contains secret scientific knowledge from a brilliant mind persists. Others have suggested Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was certainly capable of creating complex codes and was known for writing his notes in mirror script. He was also a prolific illustrator with knowledge of botany and anatomy. However, Leonardo lived from 1452 to 1519, and while this overlaps with the possible time frame of the manuscript, there is no evidence connecting him to it, and his known handwriting looks nothing like the Voynich script. Another candidate is John Dee, the 16th century English mathematician, astronomer, and occultist. Dee served as an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I and was deeply interested in cryptography and communicating with angels through a constructed language. Dee also visited Prague and had connections to Rudolf II's court, which could explain how the manuscript ended up there. However, Dee lived too late to have created the manuscript itself, though he could have owned it. Some researchers have proposed that the manuscript was created by a group rather than an individual, perhaps monks or nuns working collaboratively on a compendium of herbal and medical knowledge, encoded to keep it secret from outsiders. Still others believe the manuscript is the work of an individual genius, a polymath with knowledge spanning botany, astronomy, and medicine, who created a private reference work in a language or code of their own devising. The truth is, we don't know, and the manuscript itself offers no clear clues. There is no dedication, no colophon, the statement at the end of medieval books identifying the scribe and date. No signature beyond the possibly later addition of Tepinek's name. The author of the Voynich manuscript remains as mysterious as the text they created. Part 2. The language that shouldn't exist. Now we turn to the text itself, the strange, flowing script that fills every page. At first glance, the Voynich script looks almost familiar. The characters are elegant and consistent. They seem to flow naturally from left to right, top to bottom, just like Western European languages. The text is divided into distinct words, separated by small spaces. Some words are short, just 2 or 3 characters. Others are longer, containing a dozen or more characters. There appear to be approximately 20 to 30 distinct characters in the Voynich alphabet, though the exact number depends on how you classify certain ligatures and variant forms. Some characters appear frequently, others are rare. This variation in frequency is consistent with natural languages, where certain letters or sounds are more common than others. The script also shows features that suggest it is a genuine language, or at least a sophisticated cipher. Words appear to follow consistent patterns. Certain characters almost never appear at the beginning of words. Others rarely appear at the end. Some characters frequently appear together, forming what look like common letter combinations or syllables. All of this suggests structure, rules, grammar. And yet,
When linguists and cryptographers analyze the text more deeply, they encounter something deeply strange. A set of statistical properties that don't quite match any known language, but also don't match any known cipher. Let me explain. Every language has a characteristic statistical profile. If you analyze the frequency of letters, words, and patterns in English, for example, you'll find that certain letters like E, T, A, and O appear very frequently, while letters like Q, X, and Z are rare. You'll also find that certain letter combinations, like TH, ER, and ING, appear over and over again.
These patterns reflect the underlying structure of the language, its phonology, its morphology, its syntax. And remarkably, these statistical patterns are consistent across long stretches of text. An English speaker writing about botany will use roughly the same frequency of common letters and words as someone writing about astronomy. When cryptographers analyze an encrypted text written in a known language, they can often detect these underlying patterns, even if they can't read the individual words. This is how frequency analysis works, one of the oldest and most powerful tools in cryptography. But when researchers analyze the Voynich Manuscript, they find something unusual. First, the text shows relatively low entropy. Entropy, in information theory, is a measure of randomness or unpredictability. High entropy means the next character is hard to predict. Low entropy means there are strong patterns and predictability. The Voynich text has lower entropy than most natural languages. In plain English, this means that if you know the first few characters of a Voynich word, you can often predict, with better than random accuracy, what the next characters will be. The text is, in some sense, more predictable, more structured than typical language. This is strange. It suggests either a language with very rigid rules, perhaps an artificial or constructed language, or a cipher that preserves certain patterns from the original plain text. Second, the distribution of word lengths in the Voynich manuscript is unusual. Most natural languages show a characteristic distribution where medium-length words are most common, with shorter and longer words becoming progressively rarer. The Voynich manuscript's word length distribution is different. It has an unusual abundance of short words and follows a pattern that some researchers have compared to certain Asian languages or constructed languages. Third, there is the phenomenon of word repetition. In natural language, important content words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, are rarely repeated in immediate succession. You might write the red house, but you wouldn't normally write the red house. Yet in the Voynich manuscript, word repetitions occur with unusual frequency. Sometimes the same word appears 2 or even 3 times in a row. This could be explained if certain Voynich words are actually not words but grammatical particles or modifiers, like the or very in English, which can legitimately repeat. But it could also suggest something more unusual about the text's underlying structure. Researchers have coined a term for the language of the manuscript: Voynichese. It's a recognition that, whatever this text is, it follows its own internal logic. Voynichese has been analyzed by linguists who specialize in morphology, the study of how words are formed. They've identified what appear to be prefixes, suffixes, and root forms. Certain character sequences almost always appear at the beginning of words. Others typically appear at the end. Some characters seem to serve as connectors between root elements. This morphological structure is consistent with agglutinative languages, language like Turkish or Finnish, where words are built by stringing together morphemes, each adding a specific meaning or grammatical function. But when linguists try to apply known agglutinative language rules to Voynichese, they don't get sensible results. The patterns are there, but they don't resolve into meaning. There's another curious feature. The manuscript appears to have 2 distinct dialects or hands in its script.
Researchers have identified subtle differences in how certain characters are formed in different sections of the manuscript. This could indicate either two different scribes working from the same original text, or a single scribe whose handwriting evolved over time, or even intentional variation introduced for some purpose. Some sections of the manuscript also seem to use a slightly different character set, or have different statistical properties. The biological section, with its illustrations of nude women, shows somewhat different word patterns than the pharmaceutical section. This could reflect different subject matter requiring different vocabulary, or it could indicate something more complex about how the text was generated. Here's where we reach the central paradox of the Voynich manuscript. On one hand, the text shows too much structure, too much pattern to be random gibberish. It looks like language. It acts like language, at least statistically. The fact that it's paired with detailed, systematic illustrations strongly suggests it contains meaningful content.
On the other hand, the text resists all attempts at decipherment, and not just by amateurs or casual cryptographers, but by some of the most skilled codebreakers in history. During World War II, the manuscript was examined by William Friedman, perhaps the greatest cryptographer of the 20th century. Friedman had broken the Japanese purple cipher, one of the most complex military codes ever devised. He devoted decades of spare time to the Voynich manuscript and never cracked it. The manuscript was also studied by teams at the NSA, the National Security Agency, during the Cold War. These were experts who routinely broke Soviet codes. They failed. In the 21st century, computational linguists have applied sophisticated statistical methods, machine learning algorithms, and artificial intelligence to the text. Some have claimed breakthroughs, which we'll examine later. But the consensus remains. If the Voynich manuscript is a cipher, it's unlike any cipher ever documented. And if it's a language, it's unlike any language we know. This has led some researchers to a troubling conclusion. Perhaps the manuscript is a hoax. Perhaps it's meaningless text designed to look like language, created by a medieval con artist to fool a wealthy patron. But if it's a hoax, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated one. The person who created it would have needed to understand statistical linguistics centuries before such a field existed. They would have needed to create a fake language with consistent internal rules, applied across 35,000 words without breaking character. And they would have needed a motive. Medieval forgers typically created fake religious relics or documents with clear monetary value. What would be the point of forging an incomprehensible book? There's something else worth mentioning about the Voynich manuscript's text. Something more subjective but equally important. It has a strange psychological effect on people who study it intensely. Many researchers describe a feeling of being on the verge of understanding, that if they just look at it from the right angle, with the right method, the meaning will suddenly snap into focus. It's like looking at an optical illusion where you can sense there's a hidden image, but you can't quite see it. This effect is so powerful that it has led to a phenomenon called Voynich syndrome. Not an official medical term, but a description of what happens to people who become obsessed with the manuscript. They start seeing patterns everywhere. They convince themselves they've found the key. They announce their breakthrough only to realize, upon closer examination, that their solution doesn't actually work. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of people over the past century have claimed to have deciphered the Voynich manuscript. Each time, their solutions have been carefully examined by other researchers and found wanting. Either the proposed method only works for a few pages, or it produces nonsensical results. Or it requires so many arbitrary assumptions that it's essentially meaningless.
And yet the hope persists. The manuscript seems to promise that it can be read, that meaning is there, hidden just beneath the surface. This quality, this tantalizing, almost comprehensibility, might itself be a clue. If the manuscript is a hoax, the hoaxer was a psychological genius who understood how to create something that would fascinate and frustrate in equal measure. If it's genuine, then whoever created it succeeded in encoding their knowledge so thoroughly that even with 21st century technology, we still can't break through.
Part 3. The Impossible Illustrations. While the text of the Voynich Manuscript remains impenetrable, the illustrations offer another way into the mystery. These images are detailed, deliberate, and deeply strange. They are organized into 6 distinct sections, each with its own visual theme and apparent subject matter. Let's walk through these sections one by one and examine what they might tell us about the manuscript's purpose and meaning. The first and largest section is what researchers call the herbal or botanical section. It comprises roughly half the manuscript and contains detailed drawings of plants, each typically occupying a full page or sometimes 2 facing pages. At first glance, these appear to be botanical illustrations of the type found in medieval and Renaissance herbals, reference books describing medicinal plants. Such books were common throughout Europe and were essential tools for physicians, apothecaries, and herbalists. Each plant illustration is accompanied by a paragraph or 2 of Voynich's text, presumably describing the plant's properties, uses, or cultivation. But when botanists examine these illustrations, they encounter an immediate problem. Most of the plants don't exist. A few of the illustrations might resemble known species. One drawing has been tentatively identified as a sunflower, another as a viola or pansy, a third as a water lily. But most of the plants are botanical impossibilities, combinations of features from different species, plants with root systems that couldn't support their leaf structures, flowers with impossible geometries. One illustration shows a plant with what appears to be a daisy-like flower, but with leaves like a fern and roots like a turnip. Another shows a sprawling vine with leaves arranged in a pattern that doesn't follow any known botanical phyllotaxy, the mathematical arrangement of leaves on a stem that real plants follow. Some researchers have suggested that the illustrator was working from memory or from incomplete descriptions, which would explain why the plants seem to combine features from different species. A medieval herbalist who had heard about a plant but never seen it might draw something that blends details from multiple sources. Others have proposed that these might be symbolic or allegorical representations rather than literal botanical illustrations. Medieval texts often used plants as symbols for virtues, vices, or spiritual states. Perhaps the Voynich plants are encoding information in a visual language we don't understand. Still others believe that these might be representations of extinct or simply undiscovered plants. One controversial theory suggests the manuscript originated in the Americas and that the plants are species that existed before European colonization but are now extinct or have never been properly documented. However, the carbon dating of the manuscript to the early 1400s, before Columbus's voyage in 1492, makes an American origin unlikely, unless we're willing to entertain the possibility of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, for which there is minimal historical evidence. The second major section is devoted to what appears to be astronomy and astrology. Here we find elaborate circular diagrams, many of them resembling astrolabes or astronomical charts. Some diagrams show concentric circles with radiating lines and text, possibly representing celestial spheres or zodiacal divisions. Others show what might be stars, suns, moons, and comets. One particularly striking series of pages shows circular diagrams divided into sectors,
each containing a small human figure, usually a nude woman, along with star symbols and text. These might be astrological charts showing the influence of celestial bodies on human physiology or destiny. Medieval astrology was a serious and respected field, closely linked to medicine. Physicians used astrological charts to determine the best times for treatments, to diagnose illnesses, and to prepare medicines. So the presence of astrological content would be consistent with a medical or pharmaceutical text. But again, when modern astronomers examine these charts, they don't correspond to the actual heavens. The arrangements of stars don't match any known constellations. The divisions and cycles don't align with the real movements of the sun, moon, or planets as visible from Earth.
Some diagrams show what appear to be solar systems with a central body surrounded by smaller bodies. This is remarkable if these are meant to be literal astronomical observations, because the heliocentric model of the solar system, with the sun at the center, wasn't widely accepted until Copernicus in the 16th century, decades after the manuscript was created. Could the Voynich Manuscript contain evidence of astronomical knowledge that predates Copernicus? Or are these diagrams representing something else entirely? Alchemical processes, symbolic cycles, or purely abstract concepts? One illustration shows a series of nested circles, each labeled with text surrounding a central symbol. This could be a cosmological diagram showing the medieval conception of the universe as a series of crystalline spheres. Or it could be something else. The ambiguity is maddening. The third section is perhaps the strangest of all. Researchers call it the biological or balneological section, from the Latin word for baths. These pages show elaborate systems of interconnected pipes, pools, and chambers, populated by numerous small human figures, almost all of them nude women. The women appear to be bathing, swimming, or emerging from the pools. The connecting tubes and channels sometimes contain what might be water, depicted in blue-green ink. The imagery is so unusual that researchers have struggled to find any comparable illustrations in medieval or Renaissance manuscripts. One theory is that these represent spa complexes or bathing houses. Bathing culture was significant in Renaissance Italy and other parts of Europe, and some spas were associated with medicinal treatments. The water flowing through the tubes might represent mineral springs with healing properties. Another theory suggests these are alchemical or pharmaceutical diagrams showing the distillation or mixing of substances. The women might be symbolic representations of chemical elements or stages in a process, and the interconnected pools might represent vessels or alembics used in alchemy. A more esoteric interpretation proposes that these are cosmological or spiritual diagrams, representations of the human circulatory system. The nude female figures have been the subject of much speculation. Why so many women? Why nude? Medieval medical texts did sometimes include illustrations of nude figures to show anatomical features or humoral theory, but usually with more obvious medical context. Some have suggested the figures represent nymphs or water spirits. Others point to medieval concepts of the womb and female reproductive systems as containing liquid-filled chambers, proposing that these diagrams might be embryological or gynecological. But truly, no one knows. These pages remain among the most perplexing in the entire manuscript. The fourth section shows what appear to be pharmaceutical recipes or formulations. These pages are less illustrated and more text-heavy, but they do contain small drawings of what might be medicinal plants, jars, containers, and possibly parts of the human body, particularly organs. Each page seems to present a recipe or formula, with the illustrations showing the ingredients or affected body parts. accompanied by paragraphs of instruction in Voynichese. If this interpretation is correct, this section would be similar to medieval pharmaceutical compendia, books that explained how to prepare medicines, which herbs to combine, and what each mixture could cure. The presence of such a section would make sense if the manuscript is indeed a medical reference work. The earlier botanical section would describe the raw materials, the plants themselves, and this pharmaceutical section would explain how to prepare them for treatment. But again, we're inferring purpose from appearance. Without being able to read the text, we can't confirm that these recipes actually describe medical preparations, or anything else for that matter. The manuscript's final sections are less clearly defined. One appears to be a continuous text section with almost no illustrations. Page after page of Voynichese script, with only occasional small sketches, usually of stars or plants in the margins. This has led some researchers to speculate that it might be a prayer book, a grimoire, a book of magic spells, or simply a theoretical section elaborating on the information presented visually in earlier parts.
The very last section contains circular diagrams again, but these are different from the astronomical charts. They show what might be months or seasons, with text arranged radially around a central point. These could be calendrical tables, ways of organizing time for agricultural, medical, or astrological purposes. Medieval medicine was deeply connected to the calendar. Certain treatments were believed to be more effective during particular lunar phases or seasons. Agricultural activities followed strict calendrical rules, so a calendrical section would fit perfectly in a medieval reference work. But as with everything else in the Voynich manuscript, we're reading meaning into images that might mean something entirely different.
Part 4. Centuries of Failed Decipherment. The first known attempt to decipher the Voynich manuscript was made by its early 17th century owner, Georg Baresch, the Prague physician we mentioned earlier. Baresch spent years examining the manuscript, trying to understand its contents. He believed it contained valuable medical or alchemical knowledge, but he couldn't read it. In desperation, he reached out to Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar in Rome who was famous for his work on ancient languages and cryptography. Kircher had claimed to have translated Egyptian hieroglyphics, though his translations were later proven to be largely incorrect, and Baresch hoped he might have better luck with the Voynich manuscript. We don't know if Kircher ever seriously attempted to decode the manuscript, or if he received it before Baresch's death. After Baresch died, his friend Johannes Marci sent the manuscript to Kircher with that famous 1666 letter we discussed earlier. But there's no record of Kircher publishing any translation or analysis of it. The manuscript apparently remained in the Jesuit archives in Rome for over 2 centuries, gathering dust, until Wilfrid Voynich acquired it in 1912. When Wilfrid Voynich brought the manuscript to public attention in the early 20th century, he sparked a new wave of decipherment attempts. Voynich himself never claimed to have decoded the manuscript, though he certainly wanted to. He spent considerable effort researching its provenance and trying to connect it to Roger Bacon, believing that association with the famous medieval scholar would increase its value and prestige. He also made the critical decision to have high-quality photographic copies made and distributed to scholars around the world. This democratized access to the manuscript and meant that for the first time, multiple researchers could study it simultaneously without needing to handle the fragile original. Among the early 20th century researchers who tackled the manuscript was William Romain Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1919, Newbold announced that he had successfully deciphered the manuscript and that it was indeed written by Roger Bacon.
Newbold's method was extraordinarily complex. He claimed that the visible text was actually a surface-level cipher, and that the real message was hidden in microscopic shorthand marks that could only be seen with magnification.
According to Newbold, these tiny marks, when properly decoded, revealed that Roger Bacon had discovered cellular biology with microscopes, had described spiral nebulae in space, and had recorded other advanced scientific knowledge. Newbold's announcement caused a sensation. Here, at last, was proof that the manuscript contained revolutionary scientific knowledge from the medieval period. But within a few years, Newbold's solution was thoroughly debunked. Other scholars examined the manuscript carefully and determined that the microscopic marks Newbold had seen were simply cracks and imperfections in the vellum, natural degradation over time, and artifacts of the photography process. His decipherment method was also revealed to be absurdly arbitrary, requiring so many assumptions and interpretive leaps that it could be used to decode any text to say virtually anything. Newbold's failure was a cautionary tale. It demonstrated how easy it is to see patterns that aren't there, especially when you want very badly to find meaning. The middle decades of the 20th century saw the manuscript examined by professional cryptographers, many of them veterans of military intelligence work. The most notable was William Friedman, whom we mentioned earlier. Friedman is a legendary figure in the history of cryptography. During the 1930s and 40s, he led the team that broke the Japanese diplomatic cipher known as Purple, giving the United States crucial intelligence during World War II. After his retirement from the NSA, Friedman became fascinated with the Voynich Manuscript. He assembled a group of fellow codebreakers, many of them former colleagues from the NSA, to study it. They called themselves the Voynich Manuscript Study Group, or, more informally, the First Saturday Group, because they met on the first Saturday of each month.
Friedman approached the manuscript with all the sophisticated techniques of mid-20th century cryptanalysis. He and his group created an index of every word in the manuscript, calculated frequency distributions, looked for patterns that might indicate a substitution cipher or a transposition cipher. They worked on it for years, and ultimately, they concluded that if the manuscript was a cipher, it was unlike any cipher they had encountered in military or diplomatic contexts. Friedman developed a theory that the manuscript was written in a synthetic language, an artificially constructed language created for the purpose of encoding philosophical or scientific ideas. He pointed to historical examples like the philosophical language proposals of John Wilkins in the 17th century, where words were constructed systematically to reflect logical categories. But Friedman never completed a full translation. He died in 1969 without solving the manuscript. His papers and notes on the Voynich project show a man who was simultaneously fascinated and frustrated, convinced that meaning was there, but unable to unlock it. Throughout the mid to late 20th century, numerous individuals announced they had cracked the Voynich code. Let's examine a few notable examples. In 1943, Joseph Martin Feely, a professor at Georgetown University, published a book claiming the manuscript was created by Roger Bacon and written in a specialized shorthand system. Feely's translation revealed that the manuscript was about medieval philosophy and alchemy. But when other scholars examined Feely's method, they found it hopelessly flawed. His translation was so vague and general that it could have been applied to almost any medieval text. He was reading his own expectations into the manuscript, rather than extracting genuine meaning. In 1978, John Stoyko, a Ukrainian-American scientist, published a claim that the manuscript was written in medieval Ukrainian with the vowels removed. According to Stoyko, the text described a conflict between life forces and death forces. Again, upon examination, Stoyko's methodology was shown to be arbitrary. He was selectively inserting vowels to create Ukrainian words.
but his choices were inconsistent and often required creative reinterpretation of the script characters.
In 1987, Leo Levatov proposed that the manuscript was written by the Cathar heretics of medieval France and described their religious rituals, including a suicide ritual involving ritual poisoning. Levatov claimed the language was a mix of medieval Flemish and Old French, written in a specialized script. Levatov's theory generated some popular interest. The Cathars were a fascinating historical group, brutally suppressed by the Catholic Church during the Albigensian Crusade. But linguists quickly dismantled his claims. The manuscript's carbon dating placed it after the Cathar persecution, and his linguistic analysis was filled with errors and unjustifiable assumptions. A pattern emerges in these failed decipherment attempts. Each researcher brings their own background, interests, and preconceptions to the manuscript. The Ukrainian scientist sees Ukrainian. The student of Cathar history sees Cathar rituals. The Roger Bacon enthusiast sees medieval science. The manuscript seems to act as a kind of Rorschach test, reflecting back whatever the viewer hopes to find. As we entered the digital age, researchers gained new tools for analyzing the Voynich Manuscript. Computers could perform statistical analyses on a scale impossible for human researchers. Character recognition software could identify and categorize every glyph. Machine learning algorithms could search for patterns invisible to the human eye. In 2004, researcher Gordon Rugg proposed a provocative theory. The manuscript was a hoax, created using a method called a cardon grill. A cardon grill is a device used in cryptography, a card with holes cut in it. You place the grill over a page of text, and the holes reveal certain letters which you copy down. Then, you rotate or reposition the grill and copy more letters. This method can generate text that looks structured, but is actually meaningless. Rugg demonstrated that a skilled forger, using a cardon grill and a table of syllables, could generate text with statistical properties similar to the Voynich manuscript. Relatively low entropy, repeating word patterns, and so on. Rugg's theory was elegant and offered an answer to the central mystery. If the manuscript can't be decoded, perhaps it's because there's nothing to decode. It's elaborate gibberish, created to trick someone into paying a fortune for it. But critics pointed out several problems with the hoax theory. First, creating 35,000 words of consistent, fake language using a cardon grill would be extraordinarily tedious and time-consuming. What would be the payoff? Who was the intended victim? Second, while Rugg could mimic some statistical properties of the manuscript, he couldn't replicate all of them. Natural language has many layers of structure, morphology, syntax, semantics, and it's unclear whether a cardon grill could generate all these patterns convincingly. Third, the hoax theory doesn't explain the illustrations. If you're creating a fake manuscript to sell, why include bizarre, imaginative, botanical, and astronomical drawings that don't correspond to reality? Why not just copy illustrations from real herbals and astronomical texts, which would be more convincing? In the 21st century, researchers have turned to artificial intelligence and machine learning to crack the Voynich code. In 2017, researchers at the University of Alberta applied artificial intelligence to the manuscript, using algorithms designed to detect patterns in text and identify underlying language structures. They claimed their analysis suggested the manuscript was written in a mixture of Romance languages, possibly Italian or Latin, with the vowels removed or encoded.
Their AI analysis produced some partial translations that seemed to form coherent phrases. One famous example: they claimed a sentence in the manuscript decoded to something like, "She made recommendations to the priest, man of the house, and me, and people." But linguists quickly pointed out that this translation was awkward, grammatically strange, and only worked if you made numerous arbitrary assumptions about which Voynich's characters represented which letters. In 2019, another team from the University of Bristol used a different AI approach, analyzing the statistical structure of the text and comparing it to hundreds of known languages. They concluded that Hebrew was the most likely source language, and that the manuscript might have been written in a mixture of Hebrew and...
Again, while interesting, this analysis didn't produce a readable translation. The AI had detected statistical similarities, but similarity doesn't equal identity. The manuscript might resemble Hebrew in some ways, while actually being something completely different. The fundamental problem with AI approaches is this: AI is very good at finding patterns, but it can also find patterns that aren't there, especially if the training data is limited or the algorithm makes incorrect assumptions about the underlying structure. Until someone produces a full, coherent translation of a significant portion of the manuscript using a consistent, verifiable method, these AI breakthroughs remain interesting but unconfirmed.
Part 5. Modern science enters the mystery. For decades, one of the fundamental questions about the Voynich manuscript was simply, how old is it? Scholars had speculated based on the style of the illustrations, the apparent techniques used in the vellum preparation, and the historical provenance. But these methods provided only rough estimates. Was it from the 13th century, as the Roger Bacon theory suggested? The 15th century? The 16th? In 2009, researchers from the University of Arizona conducted radiocarbon dating on 4 small samples taken from different pages of the manuscript. Radiocarbon dating works by measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes in organic material. Living organisms constantly absorb carbon-14 from the atmosphere, but when they die, no new carbon-14 is absorbed, and the existing carbon-14 decays at a known rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains, scientists can determine when the organism died. In the case of the Voynich manuscript, the vellum, made from animal skins, could be dated to determine when the animals were killed and their hides prepared. The results were definitive. The vellum dated to between 1404 and 1438 with 95% confidence. This is the early 15th century, decades after Roger Bacon died and well into the Renaissance period. This discovery was a watershed moment. It eliminated many theories about the manuscript's origin and authorship. Roger Bacon couldn't have written it. John Dee, who lived in the 16th century, couldn't have created it. But the carbon dating also raised a new question. The testing dated the vellum, not the ink. Technically, someone could have taken blank vellum from the 15th century and written on it much later, creating a modern forgery on old material. This possibility led researchers to conduct additional tests on the ink itself. Analyzing the ink in the Voynich manuscript is more challenging than carbon dating the vellum. Ink contains very little organic material, making radiocarbon dating difficult and requires...
These analyses have confirmed that the ink is iron gall ink, consistent with 15th century European ink-making practices. Iron gall ink was made by mixing tannic acid from oak galls with iron sulfate. When first applied, it's a pale blue-gray, but it oxidizes over time to a deep brown-black. The aging patterns and oxidation levels in the Voynich manuscript are consistent with ink that is genuinely several centuries old. Furthermore, the ink has penetrated into the vellum fibers in ways that would be difficult to fake convincingly. If someone had written on old vellum in the 18th or 19th century, the ink would likely show different penetration patterns and aging characteristics. The scientific consensus, based on both the carbon dating and the ink analysis, is that the Voynich manuscript is a genuine early 15th century artifact, created around the time its vellum was prepared. This doesn't tell us what the manuscript says, but it does tell us that it's authentic, not a modern hoax. In 2014, researchers at Yale University began a comprehensive multispectral imaging project to capture the highest resolution images possible of every page of the manuscript. Multispectral imaging involves photographing an object under many different wavelengths of light. Not just visible light, but also ultraviolet and infrared. Different wavelengths can reveal features that are invisible to the naked eye. Faded text, erased corrections, layers of pigment, even the outlines of sketches that were drawn and then painted over. The imaging project revealed several fascinating details. First, there are very few corrections or erasures in the text. This is unusual for a medieval manuscript. Scribes typically made errors and had to correct them, either by scraping away the error with a knife or by crossing it out and writing over it. The near absence of corrections in the Voynich manuscript suggests either that it was copied very carefully from a well-prepared draft, or that it was generated through some systematic process that didn't require much correction. Second, the imaging revealed some underdrawings, preliminary sketches that were drawn lightly in pencil or stylus before being inked. These underdrawings show that the illustrator planned the images carefully before finalizing them. This level of preparation suggests intentionality and skill, not the hasty work of a forger trying to create a convincing fake. Third, the multispectral images allowed researchers to analyze the sequence in which elements were added to the pages. Generally, the text appears to have been written first, with spaces left for illustrations, and then the illustrations were added later. This is consistent with how many medieval manuscripts were produced, especially those created by a single person, rather than in a scriptorium with specialized illustrators and scribes. One of the most innovative recent approaches to the Voynich manuscript comes from evolutionary biology, specifically phylogenetic analysis. Phylogenetics is the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms. By comparing genetic sequences or physical characteristics, biologists can construct family trees showing how different species are related and how they evolved from common ancestors. In 2016, researchers applied similar mathematical techniques to the Voynich manuscript's text. Instead of analyzing genetic sequences, they analyzed word sequences and character patterns, looking for evolutionary relationships that might reveal the underlying structure of the language. The idea is that if Voynichese is a real language, it should show hierarchical structure, morphemes that combine into words, words that combine into phrases, phrases that follow grammatical rules. These relationships should be detectable using the same clustering algorithms that biologists use to build phylogenetic trees. The results were intriguing. The analysis suggested that Voynichese does have hierarchical structure, consistent with natural language. It's not random.
It's not just a simple substitution cipher where each symbol represents a single letter. But the structure is strange. It doesn't quite match any known language family. Some researchers have described it as being similar to agglutinative languages, but with unusual patterns of morpheme combination. This analysis lends support to the theory that the manuscript is written in a constructed or synthetic language,
An artificial language created by its author, possibly based on natural language principles, but with its own unique grammar and vocabulary. In recognition of the enduring mystery, several academic institutions and research groups have launched formal challenges and competitions to decipher the manuscript. These challenges typically involve making high-resolution digital scans and transcriptions freely available to researchers worldwide, along with tools for statistical analysis and collaboration. One of the most comprehensive projects is the Voynich Manuscript Research Platform, which provides a complete transcription of the manuscript with multiple competing theories about how to interpret certain ambiguous characters. Researchers can download the data, run their own analyses, and submit proposed solutions for peer review. So far, no submitted solution has achieved consensus acceptance among the community of Voynich researchers. But the collaborative nature of these projects has led to new insights and refined our understanding of the manuscript's statistical properties. One interesting development is the application of techniques from genomics. Just as geneticists can analyze DNA sequences to find patterns and relationships, computational linguists can analyze the Voynich text as a genome of symbols, looking for repeated motifs, palindromic sequences, and other structural features. These analyses have revealed that the manuscript has a more complex structure than previously thought. There are long-range patterns, correlations between words that appear many pages apart, suggesting that the text might have themes or topics that recur throughout, much like a real reference book would have cross-references and related discussions in different sections. Today, researchers continue to examine the Voynich manuscript using increasingly sophisticated tools. Machine learning algorithms are being trained on hundreds of historical manuscripts to recognize medieval handwriting patterns, illumination styles, and bookbinding techniques. By comparing the Voynich manuscript to this larger database, researchers hope to narrow down its geographical origin and possibly identify the workshop or scriptorium where it was created. Paleographers, experts in historical handwriting, continue to analyze the subtle variations in character formation, looking for clues about the scribe's native language and training. Even if the script itself is invented, the way the scribe forms certain strokes might reveal whether they were trained in the Latin alphabet, Greek, Hebrew, or some other writing system. And interdisciplinary teams bringing together cryptographers, linguists, computer scientists, and medieval historians continue to attack the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. The hope is that by combining all these approaches, carbon dating, ink analysis, multispectral imaging, statistical analysis, AI pattern recognition, and traditional scholarly research, we might finally assemble enough pieces of the puzzle to see the complete picture.
Part 6. The Leading Theories. After more than a century of intensive study, no single theory about the Voynich manuscript has achieved universal acceptance. But several leading theories have emerged, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Let's examine the most credible possibilities. The theory that has gained the most support among serious researchers is that the Voynich manuscript is written in a constructed or synthetic language.
an artificial language created by the manuscript's author for philosophical, practical, or mystical purposes. The idea of constructing artificial languages has deep roots in European intellectual history. During the Middle Ages and Renaissance, scholars were fascinated by the idea of creating a perfect language that would eliminate the ambiguities and irregularities of natural languages. Some scholars believed that before the Tower of Babel, humanity spoke a single, perfect language that directly reflected the true nature of reality. By reconstructing this Adamic language, or by creating a new philosophical language based on logical principles, one might gain deeper insight into the nature of God, the universe, and knowledge itself. In the 17th century, several serious attempts were made to create such languages. The most famous was devised by John Wilkins, an English clergyman and natural philosopher, who published an essay towards a real character and a philosophical language in 1668. Wilkins's language assigned words systematically based on logical categories. The word for a concept would reveal its place in a hierarchical taxonomy of all knowledge. While Wilkins's work postdates the Voynich Manuscript by over 200 years, it shows that the impulse to create artificial languages existed long before. If someone in the early 15th century had the same philosophical ambitions, they might have created their own constructed language and used it to write an encyclopedia of their knowledge.
This theory explains many features of the manuscript. The consistent internal structure of Voynichese, with its apparent morphology and grammar. The low entropy and high predictability which might result from a language constructed with regular, logical rules rather than the irregular evolution of natural languages. The apparent organization of the manuscript into distinct subject areas, like a systematically organized compendium of knowledge. The presence of illustrations that don't match reality. If the plants in astronomy represent concepts in a philosophical system, rather than literal objects, they wouldn't need to correspond to actual species or celestial configurations. The main challenge for the constructed language theory is this: if someone created an artificial language to encode their knowledge, why hasn't anyone been able to reverse engineer the system? Wilkins's language, despite its complexity, can be learned and read. Why not Voynichese? One possibility is that the key to the language, the dictionary or grammar book that would unlock it, has been lost. Without that Rosetta Stone, we're trying to understand a language with no native speakers and no comparable texts. Another possibility is that the language is so idiosyncratic, so personally tailored to its creator's unique way of organizing knowledge, that it's essentially impossible to decode without insight into that person's mind. The second major theory is that the manuscript is written in a natural language, probably Latin or an early Romance language like Italian, but encoded using a complex cipher. This theory is appealing because medieval and Renaissance scholars were indeed knowledgeable about cryptography. Cipher systems existed for diplomatic and military communication, and for protecting trade secrets or intellectual property. If the manuscript contains valuable knowledge, perhaps alchemical recipes for creating gold, herbal medicines with powerful effects, or religious ideas that might be deemed heretical, the author might have had good reason to encrypt it. However, the cipher would have to be extraordinarily sophisticated. As we've discussed, the manuscript has resisted the efforts of expert cryptographers, including those who routinely break military codes. One variant of the cipher theory suggests that the manuscript uses multiple layers of encryption. Perhaps the visible text is itself enciphered, and then that ciphertext was enciphered again, using a different method. Such a super-encipherment would be extraordinarily difficult to break, especially without any known plain text to provide clues. Another variant proposes a steganographic cipher, where the real message is hidden within what appears to be innocent text, perhaps in the first letter of each word, or in the specific choice of plant illustrations, or in some other subtle encoding. The main weakness of the cipher theory is motivation. Ciphers are tools for communication. You create a cipher so that you can send a message to someone else who knows the key. But if the Voynich Manuscript was meant to be read by someone, why has no decryption key ever been found? And if it was a personal notebook not meant to be shared, why encrypt it so heavily? One possible answer. Perhaps the manuscript was created as a kind of intellectual property protection. If you had valuable medical knowledge, you might want to record it for your own reference, but prevent others from stealing it. The encryption would allow you to consult your own reference work, while keeping your secrets safe from competitors or rivals. We've already touched on the hoax theory, particularly Gordon Rugg's proposal that the manuscript was created using a Cardan grill to generate meaningless text that looks convincing. The hoax theory has the advantage of explaining why the manuscript can't be deciphered, because there's nothing to decipher. It's gibberish designed to look meaningful. Historical precedent exists for such forgeries. Medieval and Renaissance Europe saw many fake religious relics, forged documents, and invented texts created to deceive wealthy patrons or rival scholars. If the manuscript was created as a hoax, the most likely scenario is that it was meant to be sold to someone interested in alchemy, occult knowledge, or ancient wisdom. Perhaps Emperor Rudolf II himself, who was known to be fascinated by such things and willing to pay large sums for unusual manuscripts.
The forger would need to create something that looks sufficiently exotic and mysterious to command a high price, but not so obviously fake that it would be immediately dismissed. By using a script that looked almost familiar, by including illustrations that resembled real herbals and astronomical texts, but with strange differences, and by filling page after page with consistent text, the forger could create something genuinely puzzling and therefore valuable. The main arguments against the hoax theory are, first, the effort required. Creating 240 pages of consistent fake text with hundreds of detailed illustrations would take months or even years of work. The potential payoff would need to be enormous to justify that effort. And there's no evidence that the manuscript was ever sold for a huge sum. We only have the rumor about Rudolf II paying 600 ducats, a story that appears in a letter written decades later and has never been independently confirmed. Second, the sophistication of the fake language. For the hoax to succeed, the forger would need to create text with linguistic properties consistent enough to fool scholars for centuries. This suggests a level of understanding of language structure that would be remarkable for someone in the early 15th century. Third, the scientific properties of the manuscript. The carbon dating, the ink analysis, the vellum preparation, all confirm that it's a genuine early 15th century artifact, not a later forgery. If it's a hoax, it's a contemporary one, created at the time the vellum suggests. A fourth theory, less exotic but perhaps more plausible, is that the manuscript is exactly what it appears to be. A medical and herbal reference book, written in a language or script that happened to be used by a small community and has since been completely lost. Medieval Europe was linguistically diverse. In addition to Latin, there were dozens of regional languages, dialects,
and specialized jargons. Medical practitioners often developed their own shorthand systems for recording recipes and treatments. Monastic communities might have used unique writing systems for internal communication.
It's possible that the Voynich Manuscript represents the work of such a community, perhaps an order of nuns, given the prominence of female figures in the illustrations, or a family of healers who passed down knowledge across generations. If this community was small and isolated, and if it eventually died out or was dispersed without passing on its linguistic tradition, the manuscript might be the sole surviving example of their writing system. This theory explains the medical and botanical content, which would make perfect sense for a healer's reference book, the careful organization and detailed illustrations, which would be necessary for a practical working text. The lack of other examples of this script, the community was simply too small and isolated to leave other traces. The weakness of this theory is similar to the cipher theory. If the manuscript was a practical reference work, why is it so thoroughly indecipherable? Practical medical texts are meant to be used, not to baffle their readers. As we reach the end of our survey of theories, we must confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the Voynich manuscript will never be fully deciphered. Not because it's impossible in principle, but because we lack crucial information. If the manuscript is written in a constructed language, we need the grammar and dictionary. If it's a cipher, we need the key. If it's a lost language, we need a bilingual text, a Rosetta Stone that shows the same content in Voynichese and a known language. Without these external aids, we might be able to guess at the general content based on the illustrations, but we may never be able to read the actual text with confidence. This doesn't make the manuscript any less fascinating. In some ways, it becomes more intriguing precisely because it remains opaque. It stands as a reminder that knowledge can be lost, that entire systems of thought and communication can vanish, leaving only cryptic traces. The Voynich manuscript is a messenger from the past that has lost its message. And perhaps that, in itself, is the deepest mystery of all. Closing. The enduring mystery. The Voynich Manuscript has been called the most mysterious book in the world. After our journey through its history, its contents, and the centuries of attempts to understand it, we can see why that title is deserved. It's not mysterious in the way of a supernatural artifact or an object of fantasy. It's mysterious in a more profound way. It represents a genuine gap in human knowledge, a text that was deliberately created to communicate meaning, but whose meaning has become irretrievable. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the manuscript is not what it is, but what it does to the people who study it. It has a unique power to captivate and frustrate in equal measure. Brilliant minds have devoted years, even decades, to unlocking its secrets. The manuscript has survived wars, political upheavals, and the passage of 600 years. It has traveled from medieval Europe to modern America, from the collections of emperors to the archives of universities. And through it all, it has remained silent, guarding its mysteries. What can we take away from this story? First, perhaps, a sense of humility. We live in an age of unprecedented scientific and technological capability. We can sequence genomes, photograph distant galaxies, and communicate instantaneously across the world. And yet, a 600-year-old book can still defeat us. Second, an appreciation for the fragility of knowledge. If the Voynich manuscript is a genuine record of someone's intellectual work, their botanical observations, their medical knowledge, their philosophical insights, then that knowledge has been effectively erased by the loss of the key to read it. How much other knowledge has humanity lost over the centuries? How many other voices from the past have been silenced? Not by deliberate destruction, but by simple discontinuity. The failure to pass on the means of understanding. Third, a recognition that mystery itself has value. The Voynich Manuscript has inspired countless researchers, artists, and writers. It has prompted the development of new analytical techniques and interdisciplinary collaborations. Its very inscrutability has made it productive, generating more thought, more investigation,
more creativity than many books whose contents are perfectly clear. Today, the Voynich Manuscript rests in its climate-controlled vault at Yale University, where it is carefully preserved for future generations. The entire manuscript has been digitized and is freely available online at Yale's Beinecke digital collections. Anyone with an internet connection can browse its pages, examine its illustrations, and try their hand at decipherment. This democratization of access means that the manuscript is being studied by a wider and more diverse community than ever before. Professional cryptographers work alongside amateur enthusiasts. Computer scientists develop algorithms, while historians search for parallels in other medieval texts. Perhaps one of these researchers will be the one to finally crack the code. Perhaps a new technology will emerge that makes the solution obvious in retrospect. Or, perhaps, the manuscript will continue to resist understanding, remaining mysterious for another 600 years. In the end, the Voynich Manuscript is more than a puzzle to be solved. It's a connection to a past that is stranger and more complex than we often imagine. It's evidence that medieval and Renaissance Europe contained depths of intellectual...
Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most enduring enigmas. The Voynich Manuscript is just one entry in the compendium of the unexplained. Each week, we'll explore another mystery, another unanswered question, another fragment of the past that refuses to yield its secrets. If you found this story compelling, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you have a theory about the Voynich Manuscript? What mysteries should we investigate next? Subscribe to the Relic Compendium and join us as we continue to explore the borderlands between the known and unknown. Until next time, rest well. Some mysteries are meant to be savored, not solved. Good night.